Has the new British government just undermined the United Kingdom's geostrategic interests? In October 2024, the Foreign Office announced an agreement to hand over sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. While the decision was warmly welcomed by much of the international community, it caused howls of outrage in Britain, where many believe it'll fundamentally undermine the UK's security and global influence. So, what exactly lies behind the decision, and just why is it so significant? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Kerr-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security, and statehood. We tend to think that the era of decolonisation is over. However, while most of the European colonial powers gave up their holdings in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, the process isn't quite complete. In addition to the few remaining non-self-governing territories, there are a few cases where decolonisation led to a highly controversial decision that's still contested to this day. One of the most interesting examples in modern international relations is the case of the Chagos Islands. Home to one of the most important military air bases in the world, for many decades the British government has been locked in a fierce dispute with Mauritius over sovereignty over the islands. However, while this was long an obscure and little-known issue, over the past decade it's become prominent in international affairs, with increasingly adverse effects on Britain's political, legal and diplomatic standing. The Chagos Islands lie in the Indian Ocean. More formally known as the British Indian Ocean Territory, they comprise over 60 tropical islands totalling around 56 square kilometres or 22 square miles. The largest island, Diego Garcia, is around 27 square kilometres or 10 square miles. Strategically located at the heart of the Indian Ocean, their nearest neighbours are the Maldives, around 500 kilometres or 310 miles to their north, and Mauritius, which lies approximately 1,000 kilometres or 620 miles to their southwest. Other significant neighbours include India and Sri Lanka to their north, and the east coast of Africa to their west. While the uninhabited islands were first discovered in the early 16th century, our story really begins in 1814, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. While Britain agreed to return several territories it had seized from France since 1792, under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, it would retain sovereignty over a few key locations. In addition to Malta in Europe and St. Lucia in the Caribbean, it also kept control of several territories in the Indian Ocean: Mauritius, the Seychelles and the Chagos Archipelago. Although the three territories were collectively administered from Mauritius for the rest of the 19th century, in 1903 the Seychelles became a separate crown colony, leaving Mauritius and the Chagos Islands as a single unit. This arrangement held until after the Second World War. As the process of decolonisation began, Mauritius started to call for independence. However, while Britain was initially reluctant to give up control, especially as the United States was keen to use the Chagos Islands as an airbase, by the 1960s it was clear it could no longer retain sovereignty. At this point, London therefore decided that while it would let Mauritius become independent, it would hold on to the sparsely populated Chagos Islands. In September 1965, following talks in London, it was announced that the islands would be removed from Mauritius in return for £3 million in compensation and a promise that they would be given to Mauritius if no longer needed for defence purposes. Just weeks later, the island became part of the new British Indian Ocean Territory. From the very start, there was widespread international opposition to the move. Although the British government argued that the deal was fair, many observers pointed out that it breached international law. Specifically, they noted that it was contrary to UN General Assembly Resolution 1514, the declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. Passed 5 years earlier in 1960, this explicitly stated that any effort to dismember a colonial territory was contrary to the UN Charter. As a result, in December 1965, the UN General Assembly passed a new resolution that reiterated the Mauritian right to independence and called on the UK not to take any action that would violate its territorial integrity. However, while this was followed by further resolutions noting that the establishment of military bases in the island would also be incompatible with the UN Charter and Resolution 1514, Britain refused to reconsider the arrangement. As a result, on the 12th of March 1968, Mauritius finally became independent, but without the Chagos archipelago. Indeed, by now, Britain and the United States had already begun building a military base on Diego Garcia, a process that saw the island's 2,000 inhabitants forcibly deported to Mauritius, the Seychelles, and Britain. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please do consider giving it a like, and perhaps subscribing if you haven't already. It all really helps. Thanks so much, and now back to the video. At first, the matter appeared to have been settled, and over the following decades, Diego Garcia would become one of the most significant US air bases in the world. Used as a forward operating base for US bombers, it would play a critical role in operations from Afghanistan to the Middle East. However, by the turn of the millennium, problems were mounting. On the one hand, the Chagos Islanders began to bring legal cases against the British government over their forced expulsion from the islands. This ultimately led to a British High Court ruling in 2000 that the islanders should be allowed to return to the islands, apart from Diego Garcia. Although the ruling was later overturned on appeal, the tide appeared to be turning. In the face of growing pressure, including increasingly negative press, Britain accepted that the way that the islanders had been removed had been wrong. But while it offered them compensation and permitted occasional short visits, it refused to allow them to return permanently, arguing that it would be against Britain's defence and security interests. Meanwhile, another front opened as Mauritius became increasingly resentful about how the islands had been removed. Arguing that it had been forced to give them up as a condition for independence, it began a diplomatic campaign to win over international sympathy. Having gained African support, it took the issue to the UN General Assembly. Despite strong opposition from Britain and the United States, on the 22nd of June 2017, the Assembly referred the question to the International Court of Justice. Specifically, the court was asked two interrelated questions. The first focused on whether the separation of the Chagos Islands meant that the process of decolonisation in Mauritius had been lawfully completed. The second asked about the consequences of continued British administration for Mauritius's policy of resettling the islands. In September 2018, the court heard arguments from the sides. While Britain argued that the Mauritian leaders had freely accepted the arrangement, Mauritius insisted that they'd been forced to give up the islands in return for independence. On the 25th of February 2019, the court delivered its opinion. Regarding decolonisation, it decided that the process hadn't been lawfully completed. As Mauritius had been a colony at the time of the agreement, its leaders couldn't have freely reached a deal. It also noted that Britain had been obliged to respect the country's territorial integrity. Secondly, it decided that Britain's continued administration was wrongful and ruled that the United Kingdom was obliged to end its control and allow Mauritius to complete the process of decolonisation consistent with the right of peoples to self-determination. Following this, in May 2019, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly passed another resolution demanding that Britain withdraw its colonial administration from the Chagos Islands within 6 months and cooperate with Mauritius to allow Mauritian nationals of Chagosian origin to resettle the islands. It also called on the UN and all other international organisations to recognise that the islands were in fact part of Mauritius. The opinion and the resolution amounted to a massive defeat for Britain. However, despite this, the UK initially remained defiant. Addressing the Assembly, the British representative insisted that the matter was a bilateral issue between the UK and Mauritius. In addition, Britain also emphasised that the General Assembly's direct involvement in disputes between two sovereign members set a dangerous precedent. But while the UK publicly insisted that the island status would remain unchanged and a 6-month deadline passed without any decision, behind the scenes it was clear that something would need to be done. As a result, in 2022, the sides finally began negotiations on the island status. All this came to fruition on the 3rd of October 2024, when Britain and Mauritius jointly announced an agreement. While the precise details are yet to be finalised in a treaty, the UK will recognise Mauritius's sovereignty over the islands. In return, Britain will exercise Mauritius' sovereignty over Diego Garcia for an initial term of 99 years. Meanwhile, Mauritius will be able to start a process of resettlement in the islands, excluding Diego Garcia. Although the decision was widely welcomed internationally, including by the United States, which helped facilitate the arrangement, the news immediately caused howls of outrage in Britain. Over the following days, much of the media and the right wing of British politics, including leading figures from the main opposition Conservative Party, lined up to condemn the deal. In their view, the agreement was an unacceptable betrayal of British interests by the new Labour government, which had come to power just 4 months earlier. In addition to arguing that the deal would fundamentally undermine British security, they also pointed out that it would pave the way for Britain to have to give up other territories. However, all of these arguments overlook important points. First, while the agreement was indeed concluded under the new Labour government, which came to power in July 2024, the negotiations had in fact started under the previous Conservative administration. For all their anger, they'd started the process, even if they weren't in office to make the final announcement. In this sense, much of their fury looks both hypocritical and opportunistic. Secondly, claims that it undermines Britain's security ignore the announcement that Britain will retain control over Diego Garcia and the base. More to the point, many of those complaining most bitterly don't seem to realise that the failure to reach an agreement was substantially harming Britain's political and diplomatic standing. The UK repeatedly stresses the need to respect international law. However, this was an increasingly glaring and embarrassing example of where it refused to do the same. Every time it preached a need to respect the rule of law to other countries, this was being thrown back at it. This seemingly obscure case, which was almost unknown in Britain, was undermining Britain's standing in ways many in Britain didn't understand or appreciate. Finally, on whether it sets a precedent, it's essential to recognise that this case hinges on a very specific issue under international law. The question raised was whether, during the process of decolonisation, an imperial power had the right to remove and retain a piece of territory. Under Resolution 1514, it didn't. And this was the point that was being discussed. This doesn't apply to other cases like the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, or almost all the rest of Britain's overseas territories. These are entirely different situations. That said, one other territory could be affected: the British sovereign base areas in Cyprus. Also created during decolonisation, it's worth noting that Cyprus took part in the ICJ case and has been watching these developments closely. In the meantime, this historic agreement, which has caused so much anger in certain circles, would appear to finally draw a line under one of the most controversial yet little-known chapters in Britain's colonial history and the process of British decolonisation. But of course, the Chagos Islands was just one of several controversies. Another on the horizon is the question of Gibraltar. If you want to learn more about that issue, here's another video that you might find interesting.